Githuku-Shongwe, and she's the representative for UN Women's South Africa Multi-Country Office. Very good to have you with us this afternoon, and I see that you certainly have kept to the theme color of orange for today.
Yes, Tanya. Orange for us signifies hope. So even as we mourn, we recognize that we cannot mourn as if we're hopeless. So we wear orange.
And tell us about the rate of gender-based violence. It's a scourge in South Africa, a huge scourge, but by no stretch of the imagination is this particular issue limited to South Africa alone. But how does South Africa fare in comparison to the rest of the world?
Well, truly, it is a global scourge. In fact, this is why UN Women called it the second pandemic during the COVID pandemic, intense periods. We called it the second pandemic because we found that, like everywhere in the world, annually 243 million women experience intimate partner violence. And that's not even the full breadth of the number of people who experience violence. But imagine this, Tanya, during the lockdown across the world and in Europe in particular, 30% increase in reported cases of domestic violence. So it is significant. It is a global scourge. I think what we find that in South Africa, the numbers they're pretty similar in the sense that, I think from our last DHS data, we have about 1 in 5 women who experience what we call intimate partner violence. And this is what we saw a lot during the COVID-19 is because women are locked up in their houses, in their homes with families and intimate partners. This is probably the most dominant form of violence. But what we do know as well for South Africa is that rape is a major, major issue for this country. So sexual violence is particular to our region. And it's not just South Africa. We find countries like Lesotho, Botswana, high levels of sexual violence. In fact, I think during lockdown, the crime statistics reported over 18,000 cases of intimate partner linked reports of rape in homes, in people's private residences. So it is very high. I think what is also quite dramatic in South Africa is what we call femicide, which is the killing of women, very often by an intimate partner. And I think we reported over 800 cases of murder by perpetrators who are intimate partners also during the lockdown period. So it is very significant.
You mentioned there a bit earlier on about the rate of gender-based violence and attacks during the COVID-19 pandemic. What other peculiarities did the COVID-19 period actually highlight as far as gender-based violence is concerned?
Well, as I said, the intimate partner violence one was a very, very significant one. We have just completed a rapid assessment survey in South Africa on this. And what we found quite astounding is that 90% of the female respondents who we spoke with experienced violence by a partner, but also family members. And this is something that we find not just in South Africa. In fact, it was just last week that we received a report of a significant, I think it was something like 3,000 young girls in Namibia who are pregnant from lockdown periods. And these are ones who are locked up in their homes. We had a similar story in Kenya, I think in July or August, where about 4,000 girls in one particular village were found to be pregnant, and they're locked down with their family members. So there does seem to be quite a bit of forced sex and family-related violence as well during this period of lockdown. And so that's very, very worrying because being able to really undo some of that is difficult because you're going right inside the private sort of context of people's homes. Harmful practice is another thing that we saw where in countries like Malawi and Zambia, and we have cases here in the Eastern Cape, in some of the work we've been doing in the Eastern Cape, where we had at least 3 incidences. Now, this is not even from data, this is from my direct experience in a group that we work with. At least 3 cases of families who are selling their children, their daughters, young daughters in their teens, in exchange for money for marriage. And so gains that have been made in countries like Malawi and Zambia, where we have had huge levels of child marriage, but have been reversed because of work by chiefs and traditional leaders who have done significant work to reverse that culture. have started to see it reverse some of those gains because of families being left without resource alternatives. So this was quite significant.
I'm wondering, Anne, if you could share with us some of the global best practices as far as how those in power, how governments have reacted to the ever-rising scourge of gender-based violence, and specifically within the judicial system, what measures they've put in place to help reverse this trend.
You know, Tanya, this is a really difficult one. And I think one of the things that we've been doing is doing a bit of a comparison between the way in which countries mobilized against COVID-19 versus the way they mobilized around violence. And I mean, violence is a persistent pandemic. It's not a month, 1 year long pandemic. It is a persistent one. It requires that actually we're responding as dramatically as we should with COVID-19. So one of the things that we have seen has been, positive in some countries is, first of all, being able to identify where the hotspots are. So we now know in South Africa that we have 30 hotspots that are spread across in different provinces. And because we know this now, the way we did this with COVID-19, Tanya, is that we should be having present and visible policing in those hotspots. So there should be no opportunity for anybody to violate a woman in those hotspots, because we know that's where it takes place. And so this is one of the big actions that we see. From the theme of 16 days, fund is a big issue. And one of the things that we do see is that the investment in ending violence against women is not significant enough. In some countries, it costs anywhere between 1% to 7% of the GDP to the loss of productivity and health costs because of violence. And if we estimate that for South Africa, that's anywhere between 40 to 280 billion that we need to invest to reverse the cost of violence. And so if we are going to really start taking this much, much more seriously, we need to first invest upfront in ensuring that this is properly invested in. And for the judicial system, unfortunately, what we find is that the culture of impunity, the culture of norms and stereotypes that persist, where even magistrates and judges believe that it's a domestic matter and therefore treat it flippantly or lightly. And I think this is why South Africa has been pushing these new bills and pushing to ensure that there's no parole, that there is no bail granted for gender-based violence perpetrators. And this is, where we see successful responses to violence is countries that actually insist on taking it seriously and have very strong measures to ensure that there is nowhere to hide for perpetrators of violence.
I'd like us just to dissect the theme for the United Nations Women this year. Orange the world, fund, respond, prevent, collect. Break that down for us.
So the fund point I think I've already raised, which is that knowing the cost of violence, we should be looking to invest at least anywhere between 1% and 7% of our GDP in ensuring the end of violence. And to illustrate this point, the National Strategic Plan for South Africa is costed at about 8 billion. And that's great for the programs that need to be put on the table. But if the cost is at about 100 billion, then the 8 billion is not going to really make a difference. And so funding means invest big time in the way we've done with COVID-19. We find right now that, for instance, we're working in the Eastern Cape, and there are DNA test cases that we cannot resolve cases because we cannot find DNA from perpetrators. But the labs don't exist. So we don't have enough labs to be able to gather the DNA tests. So this is just an illustration, right? So we need to really invest and make sure that we've got everything that we need to be able to prevent, but also catch the perpetrators and be able to deal with that effectively. In terms of prevention, this is an area we have not invested in significantly. So we almost wait for the cases to happen and we don't, and then we start responding. But in terms of prevention, we now know that the culture of normalization of violence, the bystander culture, which we see very prevalent in South Africa, the culture where, from a very young age, young boys believe that rape is part of the way in which you interact with girls. This is how you have intimate sexual relationships, and that consent is not even understood by young boys, but it's just a culture that is normalized, that you're dominant, and this is how you have this relationship. And so a lot of work with men, with institutions that create culture. We've got a Faith Action for Gender-Based Violence program working with over 40 churches across the country to really build a very strong prevention program. Tanya, when apartheid was ended in this country, one of the big things that happened and that we celebrated from across the world observing South Africa is that every street had street committees, had ward committees. There were activities that ensured that there was protection everywhere. So we are not taking our streets back and taking them in a way that ensures that no case passes under our nose without us responding to it. So we work in taverns. We have he for she taverns across the country where we work with men to make sure that they're preventing violence in their context.
And we'll
so
have
prevention.
Thank you so much, and certainly a lot of great work that UN Women is doing around the world. Thank you so much for your time and your insight today.